If high-altitude horror is your thing, subscribe to The Story Beyond the Impact and tap the bell. Tonight's tale is best told with the cabin lights dimmed and the aisle empty, except for what isn't. My name is Rowan Hale, lead flight attendant on red eyes long enough to make stars look like dashboard dust. You don't notice the aisle until it notices you. On East Air 141, an A321neo from San Francisco to Boston, we leveled at FL 350, Mach 0.79, packs in auto, Delta P steady at 7.7, seatbelt sign on for a vein of chop too polite to matter, cabin set to cruise blue, photoluminescent strips charged, exit plaques quiet, L1, R1, L2, R2 armed and cross-checked, all the right verbs in all the right places. Our superstition against the dark. At Aero 211, a call light dinged over 22B. The man held up his phone like a talisman. "Excuse me," he whispered, embarrassed. "Someone's crouching under the seats." "Maintenance panel?" I offered automatically, already knowing there wasn't one there. "No, I saw their arm, except it was just arm, like a hole shaped like an arm." I carried a smile and a flashlight. The smile was for him, the beam for me. In a dim cabin, shadows behave with manners. They fall away from light and shrink when scolded. I knelt, thumb to the textured barrel, and thumbed the beam under 22A, 22B, expecting dust, earbuds, and a soda tab that had escaped 2017. The light went dull, a hand's length from the carpet, as if swallowed. The aisle wasn't dark there, it was thick. I leaned farther. The photoluminescent floor path dashed its soft green along the edge. Half of one dash looked bitten. The light didn't fade. It ended, as if another shape was standing on light that had no mass to bear. Then my flashlight stuttered without losing power, the way LEDs strobe on a different frequency when filmed. Nothing changed in my hand. Something changed between the bulb and the floor. On my right, the PSU reading lights over row 21 flicked off in a tidy ripple left to right, like a finger dragging across buttons no finger touched. 2 seconds later, the ripple reversed itself, right to left, without anyone reaching. I stood, keeping my tone warm and non-contagious. "We're good," I told 22B. "Probably a cabin wiring gremlin. Happens when we dim for night. It isn't supposed to. We dim on purpose. Gremlins dim with agenda." I backed into the aft galley and lifted the handset. 2 chimes for the forward station. "Rowan," said Farah, my number 2, voice already in that careful space between amusement and plan. "Check your FAP lighting page," I said. "We're getting a ripple on 2122. Also, a flashlight dieback on the carpet." "Circuit load's normal," Farah replied. "What do you mean by dieback?" "Like the beam learned manners and got shy," I said, realizing how it sounded. "I'll walk the aisle, the NITS." "We don't say out loud in front of passengers" ran like a metronome in my head. Nature, anomalous shadow behavior and lighting interference. Intentions, monitor, contain, communicate calmly. Time, unknown. Special instructions. Keep belts on, no one crouches or lies in the aisle, carts locked as barriers if needed. I started at row 1, scanning low. Mood lighting painted everyone in deep ocean tones. The aisle runner had that faint grey sheen that makes you think of night highways. In row 7, a girl asleep with one hand dropped into the spill of the aisle. The shadow beneath her palm looked wrong, a little too tall for the distance. It leaned away from my light instead of snapping, as if it knew I was measuring it. When I raised the beam, it did not shrink like honest shade. It repositioned itself, pivoting toward the densest patch of dark like a creature seeking cover. At row 10, a white knit blanket had slid half under a seat. The blankets weaved through miniature shadows inside the yarn. Those shadows were fine. Past the blanket lay a wallet someone had dropped. The wallet's silhouette on the carpet should have been a neat rectangle. It was a rectangle stretched into a long footprint, like the aisle itself was walking past objects, instead of objects blocking light. I froze. The seat leg stanchion beside my knee cast a clean triangle. Inside that triangle, where no light should have fallen, something moved. Not the fabric, not the leg, not the air. The idea of dark, shifted, as if pulling itself tight to squeeze under the seat fastening rail. Rowan. Farah again, quieter. I'm getting passenger calls up front about shadows. Polite ones, but 5 in a cluster. I can come back, or you want me to hold? Hold, I said. We keep the forward for now. I'll block mid. I slid the service cart out and set it crosswise at row 14, brakes engaged. A physical line to pair with a polite one. The cart's stainless side gave me a shy mirror. In it, my face, my beam, and behind me down the aisle, a long black seam snaking along the runner, not aligned with any seat or overhead. The seam folded when I did, as if my reflection's shadow had its own pet. Someone in 24C whispered, "Do you see it?" "See what, sir?" "The thing that isn't there," he said with relief that I might validate his sanity. It went past my foot but wasn't a person. It was like the aisle had a swallow. I nodded as if I routinely shepherded negative space. "Keep your feet pulled in, please." "Belts fastened." Back in the aft galley, I pinged the flight deck. 2 chimes, then 3 for urgency, when no one picked up fast enough for my blood. The captain answered, unbothered, as only someone behind a locked door full of numbers can be. "Cabin, we've got lighting anomalies and reports of..." I did not say shadow creature, not because I feared ridicule, but because naming grants contour. Moving shade, floor strips dim where something passes. I'm setting a cart barrier mid. Request we keep cabin in cruise dim. Sudden full bright might scatter whatever pattern it's using. A beat of silence. I could feel them deciding whether to humor me or believe me. 2 different skills. "Seatbelts stay on," the captain said. "Radar clean. Satcom quiet. Keep me updated." I pocketed the handset and took out the torch from the galley kit, the one with a Fresnel lens that hates lies. The beam showed dust motes calmly doing dust mote life until I laid it across the aisle runner. Dust vanished midair where the beam crossed the seam I'd seen in the cart. It wasn't eating the light, it was refusing to reflect. I eased the cart forward, testing how the seam behaved. It slid away from the cart's shadow like a roach from a broom, then adhered to the back of the wheels where darkness pooled. When I stopped, it pooled too. When I moved, it moved. Stalking the stalker in the way cats trail your ankles to see if you'll lead them to the kitchen. "Sir," I told 22B on the return, "if you feel anything touch your shoes, pull them in. It isn't sticky, just..." I searched for a word that wouldn't bloom panic. "Curious." He laughed too loud, then covered it with a cough. "You're scaring me in the nice way." At row 18, the woman in the aisle seat lifted her hand as if to stroke the seam like a stray. "Don't," I said, and my voice carried farther than I intended. The seam peeled up the side of the seat base toward her fingers, stopped a centimeter short, and spread itself thin, like paint under a breath. The woman pulled back, pulse fluttering in her neck like a moth. The seam retreated, fastening itself to the dark under-seat wedge. Something brushed my ankle. I looked down and saw nothing except the fact of seeing nothing. It had weight in the negative. Heat left my sock through the knit. The hair on my shin thought we had mountains and wolves outside, instead of 0.78 Mach and -54 Celsius air. My wobble was small. Fear lives in ankles before it lives in face. "Rowan," Farah breathed into my ear from the interphone. "The forward FAP shows all good, but look at the mirror by 1L. Tell me if you see the aisle." "I'm aft." Her hesitation was a cabin length long. "The mirror shows a shadow. That isn't in the aisle. It's strolling." "Copy," I said, and the seam under row 20 flowed toward me like poured night. Careful to travel along already dark edges so as not to be seen except by someone tracking it like a broom tracks a spill. It stopped at my shoes, considered their silhouette, and pressed its outline to match mine. My shadow grew a second shadow, like a coat shrugging into a coat. I lifted the torch and against every instinct turned it full on. The seam didn't flee. It flattened, spreading wafer-thin like oil, learning a coastline. In my periphery, 3 PSU lights blinked obedience back on, as if scolded. The seam sidled around my light's hard edge and slid past my heel toward the cart. Hunger oriented to the largest available darkness. The airplane vibrated the way a hummingbird sleeps. Outside, invisible weather worked its huge life. Inside, a thing with hunger for shade learned the map of a human isle. I made another barrier. 2 carts this time, wheel locked across row 16 like a checkpoint. When the seam reached them, it didn't stop. It thinned and slipped under the gap where carpet meets metal, a skate blade of dark that refused to be stepped on. It reappeared past the wheels, bigger, as if fed by the tunnel of space it had just traversed. That was when the exit plaque over 2R pulsed once, with no input from any hand, casting an honest shadow against the bulkhead. And the seam used it like a cloak, swelling in the exact geometry of those letters, until the word exit had a second shadow that walked. I believed then. Belief is not consent. Farah, I said calmly, because the trick is to be a pond over an engine. We have movement mid-cabin. Keep the forward calm, we're staying dim. We do not let anyone kneel or dangle limbs into the aisle. If you see that mirror shadow approach 1L, you plant your feet and breathe as if you own the light. And if it doesn't care, then we teach it our grammar, I said to the darkness, and the seam at my toes tilted its long head as if considering the offer. There's a tone that lives in the cabin only between 02:15 and 03:00, the hour when even turbulence takes a smoke break. It makes people turn into silhouettes of themselves. The shadow used that tone like a language lesson. I pulled Farah for a nit's whisper at the mid-cabin carts, while the seam fanned itself under the wheels like a cat pretending to be asleep. Nature, roaming shadow anomaly responsive to contrast. Intentions, contained between carts, test with controlled light, keep doors armed and cabin seated. Time, open, special, use reflective surfaces and powder for track. Powder, she blinked. Coffee creamer, I said, tapping the drawer. Microfine. If it leaves a gap, we know what shape we're chasing. We shook out creamer along the aisle edges, careless enough to read as accidental, careful enough to paint a map. The dust drifted and settled. Where the seam lay, it did not. The creamer hovered, then dropped around the edges, as if classic physics had stuttered. A negative silhouette formed. Long, low, jointed wrong for a person, more like an animal designed by someone who had read about animals but never seen one. Passengers watched because people always do. Curiosity is stronger than fear until it isn't. I raised the handset. Good evening, folks. Quick note from your lead up front, I said in my neutral cadence that makes even fires sit down. We're seeing a minor cabin lighting irregularity. It can make shadows do silly things. Please stay seated with belts fastened, feet pulled in, and hands off the aisle. If your reading light toggles on its own, just press it once to turn it back off. We'll keep the mood lighting steady. Thanks for helping us keep the cabin calm. The seam crawled forward as if the announcement were a current and it a leaf. At row 13, the number airlines pretend not to believe in, it paused like a cat considering a new couch. A boy in 13F had a tablet open on low brightness, the moving graphics threw tiny black boats across his lap. The seam rose, impossibly, to nibble those boats out of the air. The boy giggled because it looked like a trick. His mother reached to swipe the tablet off. The seam detoured to follow her hand and then, like a polite dancer, returned to its partner. The dark. I clicked to full bright for a single breath. The cabin flinched. So did the thing. Its shape didn't vanish. It fractured into smaller slivers that ran to the nearest anchor points, under seats, beneath armrests, along the seat track that disappears under carpet at the aisle edge. When I slid us back to cruise dim, the fragments reassembled, not exactly where they'd been, but close enough to prove a mind with no face. Copy on bright being a bug spray, Farah murmured. More like a light switch in a roach motel, I said. It scatters, but does not leave. The forward mirror by 1L, the polished panel we use to check for stragglers before arming, tilted the aisle at me like a spare frame. The reflection showed the seam before it reached a place, as if the mirror were a second ahead. In the glass, the shadow slowed by row 8 and stood up, not tall, just higher, like dark learning knees. In the actual aisle, nothing stood. The seam lay flat and patient. The mirror exhaled a breath of fog from inside the cabin. A magic trick no condensation chart explains. "Rowan," Farah whispered, "the mirror shows it turned toward me." "Step back," I said, and the seam in the real aisle didn't budge while the mirror seam flowed forward, pressing the word exit across the glass until it read exi, then exi, then a rectangle of raw black. We tested reflectives. The stainless kettle showed the seam as a bruise sliding over steel. The beverage cart's chrome latch showed it as a thin absence where the world should have doubled. The window at 12A showed nothing but the shallow reflection of the cabin. The thing refused to be doubled by stars. Passengers started whispering to me now, names of where the seam had been, as if giving me a breadcrumb trail they were proud to have collected. You can build panic from rumors, you can also build order. I gave them jobs. "If your row sees the ripple," I said softly, passing, "let your reading light blink twice, not on, just one quick tap on, tap off. We'll map it." The cabin joined our science. A scatter of blinks marked the seam's path like bioluminescent plankton, answering the wake of a ship you can't see. Up the aisle past row 19, cross at 17, pause at 15. The shadow liked 13. It paused as if thinking, and then laid itself along the aisle runner's weave, making the runner look like a mouth with teeth. "Interphone," I asked, and Farah moved to the handset so she could keep a voice in my ear. "Forward status," she said. "Mirror shows the reflection of you plus something. Looks like someone behind you when there's nobody behind you." "Copy." "And Rowan." Her voice was the hush you get right before wake turbulence. "The floor path just dimmed, one dash at a time. It's choosing where we would crawl if we needed to." "Understood," I said, and set another cart at row 10 to make a corral with the one at row 16. The seam flowed toward it, slowed, tested the gap between wheel and carpet, then thinned and seeped through. I slid the wheel a centimeter so the gap moved. The seam changed tactics, lifting itself in a sheet to spill over the cart's lower crossbar like water taught to hate shine. When it fell, the powdered creamer swirled away from its edges as if repelled. The seatbelt sign pinged once by itself and went steady. I glanced up. The exit over 2R pulsed again, dim, bright dim. The seam answered by standing in the mirror and sliding in the aisle, dual behavior like a bilingual. I needed a stupid test. I crouched and put my hand flat on the runner 2 rows ahead of the seam. My shadow fell across the carpet in a soft handprint. The seam slid forward and stepped into it. My shadow went colder, not my hand. The shadow of my hand cooled against the carpet it pretended to occupy. Every hair on my arm saluted a physics I hadn't been introduced to. I pulled my hand away. My shadow hand stayed a second longer than it had any right to, as if convinced it belonged to someone else now. A muffled click-click came from the aft lav, the smoke detector test tone trying to be born, failing at the last syllable. The seam turned its attention that direction, like a wolf hearing a twig. The reading lights over row 27 volunteered 2 blinks the way we taught them. The creature had a taste for error. We improvised an exorcism of procedure. "Door?" Farah said softly over the interphone, because words make walls. "Armed," I answered, as much to the aisle as to her. "Passengers?" "Seated. Cross-check. Armed." The seam didn't stop. It did, however, hesitate. It peeled itself off my shadow like a sticker tired of sticking and slid toward the aft curtain. The curtain's hem lifted with no air to blame. The seam passed through the weave and drew the pattern up into itself. The alternating squares of light and dark on the fabric went uniform gray. When the shadow let go, the pattern snapped back and the curtain sighed like a person. "Rowan." the captain said finally in my ear, voice threaded with that rarest of cockpit admissions, respect for a thing he could not fly. We've got a smooth ride to Minnesota and a smooth ride through this. Keep your aisle. We'll keep the numbers. A call if anything touches hardware. It already touched ours, I said, eyeing the creamer's negative shape. It learns by going where light wouldn't. As if to punctuate that, the mood lighting momentarily decided it was sunrise, a warm amber blush across heads and ceiling. The seam shredded into a dozen eel-slim streaks that dove for chair legs and seat tracks, and the thin underseat glow we install, so people can find bags without finding the floor with their teeth. In the mirror, all those slivers recombined into a single upright absence that paused at row 6 and cocked a head I could not see, and then flowed forward toward 1L. "Hold it," I breathed. "Do not put a hand near that door. Plant your boots and be the brightest thing in the world." Farah said nothing, only steadied her breath so the whole forward galley could borrow it. The upright absence in the glass stopped one pace short of her shoes. In the actual aisle by row 9, the seam laid itself like an obedient rug, and then the Immer triple chime rang without a finger, pure, surgical, the sort of sound that teaches adrenaline its true name. The shadow, both versions, tilted as if listening to a teacher. The floor path dashes in front of me went dim, dimmer, out, then relit bright in a row toward the aft door as if offering a route. "Not your route," I told it, and the runners' dashes held their breath as if they understood English. In the hush that followed, the seam made a choice. It flowed back down the aisle instead of forward, pressed its length along the runner like a spine, and oh God, stalked. Head down, long body, the patience of something that has lived in hallways longer than people have had shoes. I put my palm against the cart's cold metal and said to a thing that was made of knot, "You can walk here. You don't get to arrive anywhere." The seam paused at my feet, so close the powdered creamer at its edge trembled, and then it slid around my shoes the way water forgives rocks. It was learning our grammar. Your lead cabin on a red eye, and a shadow begins moving against the light down the aisle. What's your first move? A, full bright to scatter it. B, use reflective steel mirrors to see ahead. Or C, dust the floor with creamer to track its outline. And why? The seam learned pace. It hugged metal the way water loves gutters, flowing along seat tracks, flattening under crossbars, refusing any shape that wasn't edge. Farah and I kept it corralled between carts at row 10 and row 16, while passengers did the job I gave them. 2 blinks if they saw the ripple. Little stars winked across the ceiling, a constellation spelling our hunt in Morse. I needed height. I tore a packet of space blanket from the medkit, mylar crinkles like tinfoil thunder, and spread a square on the aisle. Light made it a lake. The seam hit the mirror lake's edge and lifted. Not much, just enough to exist as absence above the floor, a shoulder of nothing rounding into a head of nothing. In the mylar it showed as a bruise that had learned knees. "Okay," I breathed. "It can stand if you give it an upright horizon." We formed a light corral. 2 torches from aft, Farah's from forward. On my count, we panned beams inward, leaving a slit of dark down the runner. The creature filed through, patient, predatory, as if the aisle were a track it had always owned, and we were the ones trespassing. Passengers whispered, "Door?" like a password when I passed. I answered armed every time, quiet as wool. Ritual turned the air to rails. The exit over 2R tried one more pulse. Farah tapped the FAP like a rosary. The glow obeyed. At row 13, the thing paused to taste the negative handprint I'd made earlier. It nested itself inside my shadow's outline, enlarging it by a finger width, testing if the hand would move without me. It didn't. Mine stayed mine. The negative let go and slid on. The forward mirror was seconds ahead again. In the glass, I watched it choose a height, child small, aisle thin, and angle its head toward 1L. In reality, it remained low, pressed to the runner, stalking nothing and everything. "Captain," I called on INT, voice even. We're herding a moving shadow mid-cabin. Request no full bright, no PA dings, cabin cooperating. Copy, he said. You own the aisle, we'll own the numbers. I gave it a decoy, the service manual's evac diagram, black silhouettes on white. I slid the page across the runner and held my torch sharp on the little pictogram running to the door. The seam rose, thin as floss, to sip at the printed shadow like a hummingbird cup's color. The paper turned cold in my hand. The pictogram's black looked lighter after, as if some of its ink had been eaten by idea. Rowan, Farah warned. Mirror shadow at 1L, upright now, hands by its sides. That's new. Hold the line. I set the space blanket upright on the cart, like a silver door, and angled my torch across it. The creature's reflection swam toward the shine, as if it preferred a world that could double it. In the real aisle, the seam flowed past my shoes, head dipped, long spine of night, and stopped in the silver doorway, as if pressed against an invisible glass. I spoke to it the way we speak to panicked humans. Here is the rule. You can move. You cannot arrive. Behind me, the floor path dashes in 12, 11, 10 dimmed, then brightened, as if the airplane itself were learning the word rule. The seam's head tipped. Not submission, consideration. A cough, false start, from the aft lav smoke detector. The creature twitched toward the sound, then reoriented to the largest darkness it could see, under the forward cart. It slipped like a ribbon under the lower rail, climbed the cart's own shadow, and stood to full height behind the mylar. Taller than a child now, aisle slim, shoulders like quotation marks. Passengers held their breath as if their exhale might feed it. I gave them a job. On 3, I said low. 2 blinks, all rose. Make a river, we counted. Blinks flowed forward like a tide. The thing listened to the light and swung its head as if mapping. Then it copied. 3 PSU buttons in a row blinked back, its own river, moving aft past 14, 15, 16. It would not be the only student in class. Time to teach it something it can't fake, I said to Farah. Wait. I tapped the cart brakes off and shoved. Metal squealed, wheels thumped, mylar quivered. The seams upright in the mirror stepped backward. The seam in the aisle didn't. It stayed under the cart and let the cart roll over it, lengthening like night at winter noon. It could stand in reflection and lie in reality. It could stalk on 2 maps at once. Copy the new rule, Farah whispered. We keep it busy switching. We pinned it again between carts. I drew a thin creamer line right across the runner. The powder shivered and fell into a notch that wasn't there. Its mouth. The seam hesitated. First time since row 21. Unsure whether to swallow a road or obey it. We had given the aisle an animal, and the animal a leash. For the moment, each believed in the other. Shadows only look like hunger when you don't give them verbs. Ours had learned crawl and stand. It wanted a third word. The mirror told me before the aisle did. At 1L, the upright absence turned its head and leaned, not tall enough to reach the handle, interested anyway. Do not touch hardware, I breathed. Boots planted. Farah's silhouette stayed rock, hands open and visible, the posture we use when turbulence slams someone into a galley door. The absence stopped an inch shy of her toes and breathed a nothing breath cold enough to silver the mirror. I watched her exhale fog back at it like a challenge. In the real aisle, the seam pressed flat to flow beneath the forward cart's shadow shelf, then rose in tiny testes under the crossbar, 1, 2, like a cat testing a countertop it knows is forbidden. I took the QRH, the pilot's Bible, from a stowage, laid it on the runner and opened to the doors page. Big diagram, fat black latch icons. The seam touched the ink, and the icons seemed to tilt a degree, as if an idea were already practicing a grip. No, I told it. Neutral tone, syllables like handles. Door, Farah from forward answered on our private PA. Armed. Passengers. Seated. Cross-check. Armed. The call and response rolled down the cabin in a hush. The seam withdrew from the latch icon and lay still enough to hear dust land. The captain. Cabin. We've contained a mobile shade between carts. It prefers edges and printed shadows. It stands in reflections, a small silence from the flight deck. Then the confidence you borrow when metronomes rule. Roger, we're smooth up here. If you need a pulse of bright, call it. Hold, I said. I had another tool, movement. I asked two aisle seat passengers at 12D and 12E, would you swap seats with each other, slow, belts rebuckled? They traded places like chess pieces. Their shadows traded too, sliding over the runner. The seam followed the shadow that moved, not the body. It wanted shape, not flesh. That told me what to protect. Silhouette. I turned off a handful of reading lights at random, then brought one back over the cart. The seam stretched into that island like an animal toward a porch light, then stopped when the light narrowed. I watched its head tilt, map recalculating. It wanted to be led. Good. I led it away. Farah tilted the forward mirror a breath. The absence in the glass turned from 1L, took one slow step down aisle, then another, like a reflection obeying a person who wasn't there. In reality, the seam slid from under the cart and flowed aft, hugging the runner's weave. Passengers, my brave choir, tapped 2 blinks, 2 blinks, 2 blinks, a soft drumline of consent. At row 18, a sleeping girl's hand fell into the aisle again. The seam curved around her fingers without touching. It could have worn her hand like a glove. It chose manners. What do you want? I whispered, more to test my own voice than to get an answer. It answered in grammar. The floor path dashes in front of it blinked in sequence, like a runway centerline teaching takeoff. Dash, 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 forward. The exit plaque over 2R pulsed once, not greedy. The mirror at 1L fogged a ring the size of a face, and then cleared, as if breathing on glass to see if a world answers back. Not arrival, I told it. Not yet. Walk. Farah stood easy in the forward galley and lent me a smile I could hear. We're rewriting the safety card, she said. We herded it to row 20, then 22, learning the limits of its patience. Fulbright still shattered it into eels. Long dim let it think. Mirrors predicted it. Steel contained it. Powder outlined it. Light taught it. The seam reached the aft curtain and did something that made my ribs remember caves. It flattened itself up the fabric, climbed 6 inches, and looked back. No eyes, just orientation. At the cabin it had walked. A hunter's check of terrain. Then it sloughed down in a silk fall and pressed its chin to the runner like a dog waiting for the next command. Rowan, the captain said softly, as if trying not to scare a bird from the edge of a hand, we'll be top of descent in 20. Whatever you're doing, keep it. Copy. I let the aisle hear me. We're staying in flight. You can move. You cannot arrive. The floor path dashes did not argue. The seam nosed the creamer line I'd drawn earlier, did not eat it, and flowed to rest exactly between our carts, spine aligned with the airplanes. It had learned the aisle. It had not learned the door, and it was waiting. The aisle quieted the way a jungle does when the apex hunter lies down. Our seam stayed between carts, spine aligned with the runner, as if the airplane had taught it how to nap. Passengers breathed again. The cabin took that as permission to get weird. A hush walked the ceiling left to right above row 9, like fingertips along PSU panels. One reading light trembled, then steadied. Another blinked twice, our code, only nobody's finger was on it. The seam didn't move on the floor. Its reflection in the forward mirror did, upright, listening, head slightly cocked toward 1L. Copy ceiling activity, I told Farah. Hold your ground, boots planted. We dusted another faint line of creamer across the runner. The powder fell in a clean ribbon. Nothing crossed it. Above us, plastic liner side, I saw a screw head rotate a degree and stop. That's the sound that wakes crew dogs. Metal, thinking about forgetting torque. Aft lav click, came Farah in my ear. Smoke detector's pre-tone, cut short. The aisle seam flinched, then held. In the mirror its twin turned as if it had heard prey in the duct. I gave it something else to chase. Light on a leash. 12D. "Can I borrow your phone flashlight?" A nervous nod. I set the phone on the floor and panned a narrow beam down aisle. The seam flowed after the moving island of white like a blackfish shadow under a boat. When I flicked the beam off, it stopped, flattening like spilled ink waiting for a cloth. "Good," I murmured. "It wants motion without mass." The aircraft quivered. Cat, no one ordered. 3 seconds of honest bumps. Seatbelts thunked. A child squeaked. The seam didn't jolt or shiver. It slid up turbulence, riding the dark that deepened under armrests. Shadows usually obey light. This one surfed contrast. "Cabin?" the captain called. "Contained," I said. "Recommend no seatbelt off dings. We'll keep them seated." I raised us to bright for 1 heartbeat. The seam shattered into eel slivers that dived for seat tracks and chair legs. The ceiling hush scattered like beads. Back to cruise dim, and the slivers flowed together again, slightly offset, as if reassembling teaches it new joints. At 1L, the mirror fogged in a coin and cleared. The upright absence lifted its hand, nothing where a hand would be, and mimed a reach it couldn't complete. In reality, the floor seam remained obediently low. Mirrors were futures, aisles were facts. "Door?" I said. "Armed," Farah answered, voice like a keel. "Passengers?" "Seated." Cross-check. "Armed." The exit over 2R pulsed once, as if to test the choir. The pulse died inside our answer. I stepped past the forward cart and set a mylar panel upright, a silver door that gave the thing a place to see itself. The bruise in the reflection approached, stood, bowed, a child's height choosing manners, and turned down aisle. On the floor, the seam stayed long and low, then flowed aft exactly as the reflection had promised. "Top of descent in 25, the captain said. "We'll keep it boring. You keep it walking." The ceiling gave me one more warning. A line of reading lights over 6, 7, 8 went out and then relit with military neatness. Somewhere above the liner, something had just practiced formation. We tightened our corral. The seam reached row 18, curved around a sleeping hand without touching, and came to rest with its chin on the creamer line, as if the aisle were a riverbank and we'd told it stay. For now, it listened. Monsters are easy if they're hungry for people. Ours wanted shapes. I gave it bait that wouldn't bleed. From the med kit, I taped 2 space blankets around a headrest and an empty coat, making a man out of glare. In the mirror, the upright absence turned toward my tinfoil scarecrow like a moth to a porch. On the floor, the seam lifted a finger's height, testing, then stood behind the silver, thin and aisle tall, wearing the coat's shadow like a jacket it hadn't earned. "Rowan," Farah said softly, "if it copies a person, it'll look for a person's next move." "Then we make the move ours," I said. We ran the departure chant the way some crews hum a hymn before takeoff. "To gay," I whispered. "Positive rate," Farah answered. "Gear up." "Climb." Passengers joined in, not understanding anyway. The floor path dashes blinked forward instead of toward a door. The seam in the aisle elongated downstream like a flag in a steady wind. In the mirror, the upright unit took 1 pace down aisle and, God help me, looked back to see if we were watching. We were. "Aft lav click," Farah warned again. The seam tilted that way. I clicked a reading light at row 12 twice. It chose the light instead of the error, learned preference, almost obedience. ATC slid into VHF like a hand into a glove. East Air 141 descend and maintain flight level 240. Reality loves a board controller. "Leaving 350 for 240, came smooth from the flight deck. The cabin loosened a notch, so did the thing. It flowed as if the airplane's own descent were a leash tug. Then someone at 21C dropped a phone. It hit the runner and spun, flashlight on, throwing a rolling bright coin. The seam pounced. It wore the circle like a crown, then plunged under it, dragging the light along the carpet as if learning theft. The phone stopped against a seat leg. The light lay square across my boot. The seam tested my silhouette again and did not bite. "Sir," I said, kneeling, "I'm going to slide this back with my shoe." The seam allowed it. The coin of light skittered to 21C's toes. He dragged it in with a whisper of gratitude. His calves shook until they didn't. The forward mirror jumped time by 2 heartbeats. It showed the absence at row 4 already. The floor seam was still at row 7. I put a palm up to the glass from afar, as if to greet someone across a bay window. The fog circle bloomed where my hand would be, and faded. The bruise head tilted, then complied with the slower map. It waited for its body. Door? I asked our choir. Armed. Passengers? Seated. Cross-check. Armed. The seam slithered to row 3, then 2, then stopped as if the word had a wall. In the mirror, the upright spread its fingers, nothing where fingers should be, and didn't touch 1L. Seatbelt sign stays on, the captain said, voice velvet over steel. Descent continues, we're with you. A tiny bright pulse, half a second on my call. The seam shattered and regrouped behind the forward cart, startled like a school of fish, then returned to our Silverman as if embarrassed. Good, we could startle it without making it run. Farah lowered the mylar a hair. The upright absence in the mirror nodded and took a pace aft, then another, giving up the door like a child stepping off a chalk line. On the floor, the seam followed long and low, threading back through the powder we'd sown, leaving a negative wake. We walked it mid-cabin again. The exit over 2R pulsed once more, tempted. Our answer stamped it flat. The floor path dashes blinked politely forward toward nowhere in particular. The route you take when the only safe destination is time. Top of descent in 15, the flight deck said. The airplane felt like a promise kept. At row 16, the seam hesitated. In the mirror, it stood at row 10 and cocked its head at the silver scarecrow as if deciding whether to keep wearing our shapes. It had learned crawl, stand, and walk. It hadn't learned arrive. That was the only word we couldn't let it own. Here's the game, I told a creature made of difference, and everyone made of fear. We keep moving. We do not open anything in flight. The seam flattened like a sigh and slid to rest between our carts, exactly where we'd first taught it stay. Powder quivered at its edges. The cabin held a breath. The mirror stayed clear. We had fed it motion. Next, it would ask for meaning. ATC's boredom rolled in like a sedative. East Air 141, descend and maintain 12,000, reduce to 210 knots. 210, 12,000, the cockpit read back. Auto thrust sighed. The cabin's hiss changed key. Belts stayed on. Our seam stayed between carts like a hunting dog forced to heel. The forward mirror stayed 1 or 2 heartbeats ahead of reality. In glass, the upright absence had learned to walk at aisle height, hands by its sides, pausing every few rows like it was reading the exit plaques as scripture. On the floor, the long seam remained low, obedient, patient. Its edges scalloped where the powdered creamer refused to settle. Flaps won. The cabin air thickened like velvet. The seam didn't fuss. It flowed into thicker darkness wherever geometry deepened it. Under armrests, along seat tracks, beneath the cart's shadow shelf, it had stopped hunting people. It hunted contrast. I borrowed that. Phones, please, I whispered to 12D and 18C. Lowest brightness, screen white. 2 small islands of light glowed. I dragged one down aisle with a fingertip, making a lane. The seam followed the lane, a blackfish shadow under a boat. The other phone stayed parked by the aft cart, a lighthouse to keep it from surging. Top of descent in 10, the captain said. We're keeping the ride civilized. A woman at 9A lifted her window shade a finger to check for dawn. The window reflection laid a weak, duplicate aisle across the pane. In the glass, the upright absence took a step into the reflection and halted, as if the window weren't a portal, but a picture it could only smudge. In the real aisle, the seam pressed its chin against the runner and waited for the next verb. Door, I said, ritual like rails. Armed, Farah answered from forward. Passengers? Seated. Cross-check. Armed. At row 13, the seam hesitated at the cold handprint I'd sacrificed earlier. It tried to wear the outline of my palm again, then let it go with what read absurdly like restraint. In the mirror, the upright tilted its head as if watching me watch it. Flaps 2. The aircraft's bones creaked the good creak. The floor path dashes ahead of the seam, blinked in sequence, forward, forward, as if offering taxi guidance to nowhere. The exit over 2R pulsed once in temptation. Our call and response smothered it before a passenger even glanced up. We needed a way to pen a thing that hated being a box. I taped 2 more space blankets to carts so their chrome rails made a shiny corral. 4 panels shoulder high, a silver kennel. In that pen, light doubled and tripled. The mylar turned absence into bruise. I left 1 gap facing aft, a door that wasn't. Light tunnel, I told the volunteers. Phone beams slid like careful swans. The seam followed the lane and stood in the pen, upright in reflection, low in reality, wearing the scarecrow's coat shadow like a borrowed suit. Its head turned toward the aft lav, click, then back to my moving light. Decision learned, preference learned. We were teaching a creature made of not to lose interest in door. ATC again, East Air 141, descend and maintain 6,000, expect the ILS 17. The mirror fogged a coin and cleared. The upright absence bowed, as if acknowledging a plan, and took 1 patient aisle slim step not toward 1L, not toward 2R, but with us. The aisle listened. Approach brief filtered aft. Indistinct on purpose, enough to calm. The seam held our pen like a cat that has agreed to be furniture until it hasn't. The forward mirror betrayed a future I refused to accept. In glass, the upright absence turned once more toward 1L and mimed a reach a child might try when no one's watching. Plant, I breathed. Farah's boots glued to galley deck, hands visible, palms open, no hardware. The mirror fogged from the inside, as if the absence were practicing breath. On the floor, the seam flattened, a sheet creeping low along the runner toward row 8 where the mylar glare thinned. It was auditioning a threshold. We moved the threshold. Phones, now. 3 glow ponds slid. 1 aft, 1 mid, 1 forward. Light stitched a new path, a figure 8 that never intersected a door. The seam took the stitch, flowing into the loop like it had always loved curves. The upright bruise in the mirror obeyed the loop a beat later, cheeks, if it had cheeks, brushing the word exit without owning it. Flaps 3, the FO sang. The RA, real, stirred somewhere far ahead. The cabin leaned into the story gravity tells when it's time to go home. Rowan, came Farah. Mirror shape's height is changing. Taller than a child, not adult. Trying. Make it kneel, I said, and realized how stupid that sounded until she understood. She lowered the mylar panel to half height. The bruise in the glass folded, diminishing to match the new horizon. On the floor, the seam pressed down, longer, flatter, kneeling without knees. I took the safety card, those happy pictograms of people obeying, and slid it onto the runner. The seam lapped at the printed arrow pointing to exits, then recoiled as if the ink meant arrive. It nudged the little drawing of a belt instead, and sipped that shadow like a tonic. Good, I whispered, absurdly proud. You can have belt. You can't have door. The smoke detector tried one last coy click in the aft lav. 2 PSU buttons blinked twice in our code. The seam hesitated, chose our light instead, and flowed along the figure 8, a continent of not blackening creamer edges without disturbing a grain. Gear down. The cabin made that collective microscopic inhale that means this will end. The floor path dashes ahead of the pen blinked, forward, forward, and I watched 3 passengers grip armrests, then relax when I said simply, seated. The mirror. The upright absence lifted a nothing hand and held it palm out, inches from 1L. A child promising not to touch. Farah exhaled fog on the glass and drew a small circle with a knuckle. The bruise mimed the circle back and then lowered its hand. Minimums would come soon. The pen wouldn't hold through rollout if panic surged. I needed a last lesson. Departure chant, I said, soft as felt. Too gay, Farah breathed. Positive rate. Gear up. Climb. Passengers added a whisper of the last word. The seam answered by lengthening aft, away from thresholds, spine straight on the runner like a runway centerline deciding to be a river. In the mirror, the bruise turned from 1L and walked with us, small head high, as if the aisle could be a life it chose. The RA called 100. I set one palm on the forward cart, one on the aft, and gave the cabin the only sentence that belongs on both ends of a night. We do not open anything in flight. The seam stilled. The mirror cleared. The exit over 2R stayed dull as a coin no one spends. The aisle, blessed human stupid aisle, was a strip of carpet again with powder where a story had slept. Outside, the approach lights were already stitching their Morse into the nose. Inside, Farah smiled without her lips moving and said to the ship, like you say it to a person who has survived a hard learning, "Cabin ready." The RA counted us down like an old lullaby with all the teeth filed flat. 50, 40, 30, 20, retard. The mains kissed, spoilers honest, reverses breathed. We tracked centerline with that little left-right needle of fate, steady as a lie detector on a monk. 70 knots, the captain said, vacating left. Taxi lights painted the wet. The cabin exhaled a civilization's worth of breath. Our pens still held mid-cabin, 2 carts and 4 sheets of mylar, making a corral of borrowed stars. Inside, the seam lay long as a runway, chin on the creamer line like a trained dog waiting for the word, okay. In the mirror at 1L, the upright bruise watched us taxi as if rides mattered to shadows. Chocks in, ground said minutes later. Beacon off. You can feel a jet settle into gravity like a ship finding harbor. The sentence we'd protected all night finally belonged to this altitude. Cabin crew, disarm doors and cross-check. I wanted to sing it. I said it like iron. Farah's pin left 1L with a homely little clink. My hand found L2's, cool metal, living world. L2 disarmed, cross-check good. The jet bridge rolled. The forward camera's audio bled into the area mic. Rubber collar kiss, telescoping groan, the hush of tile air. The header over the bridge said A14 like ops had promised. No B17, no C9. My ribs unclenched a notch I didn't know had gears. I cracked the aft curtain and checked down aisle. The seam lifted its head, thin, curious, then flattened as if the word disarm had taken away its knees. In the mirror it stood a child's height and didn't reach for anything. Good. Rowan, Farah said, not turning from 1L. Mirrors clean. She smiled at passengers in that way that puts pennies back into circulation. Welcome to Boston. Please remain seated until you know the rest. People stood anyway, because that's how humans celebrate laws working. A boy in 13F peered over the cart pen. Is it going to get out? No, I said, and gave him a job. You and I are going to watch it be bored. We rolled 1 cart 2 rows forward, then 2 rows aft, shrinking the pen as if we were folding a tent around a polite animal. The seam obliged, length shortening with each move. The powder at its edges trembled like a road in heat. A forward knock, 221. Correct, comfortingly dumb. Farah answered with glove to frame, a ramp agent's grin answering a ramp agent's code. The bridge's breath came in warm, kerosene sweet. My radio heard a stroller request and a wheelchair code. The world was paperwork again. At 1L, Farah opened. The jet bridge mouth was human. Our mirror bruise did not enter. On the floor, the seam flowed aft instead of forward, as if the brightest place in the cabin had become a fence it respected. Deplaning rows 1 through 5, Farah sang. People walked. Footsteps on jet bridge metal made the recorder happy for all the wrong reasons. In the mirror, the bruise watched each person go by and copied nothing. I eased the cart another row, tightening our little zoo. The seam shrank to a handspan, then a wrist, then to the outline of a strap across the runner. When I lifted the cart's lower rail a centimeter, it poured to fill the shadow I'd made. When I moved the rail, it followed. Passengers trickled aft, one brave at a time. "Is that real?" whispered 22B, the man who'd started our hunt. "Real enough to obey rules," I said. "Mind your step." The last coach row cleared. The seam, finely cornered between cartwheels and a seat track, made its first and only impolite move. It slid into the track, the aluminum channel where carpet meets fittings, and vanished as if poured into a throat the airplane had always had. The creamer line shivered, then settled. The mirror showed an empty aisle, my own tired face, and a door with fingerprints where only hands had a right to be. "Forward clear," Farah called. "Aft?" "Aft clear," I said, and meant it with a superstition I could live with. We walked the empty cabin the way you walk a stage after curtain, checking for scarves, for phones, for ghosts with good manners. I lifted the curtain hem, the pattern kept its squares. I pressed my palm to the runner at 13. My shadow stayed the exact shape it should be. The powder sketched a pale biography, loops and lengths, a figure-8 learning patience, already smearing into housekeeping. The mylar scarecrow hung limp, a silver man who'd done his night's work. In the forward mirror, only us. No bruise, no fog coin, just Farah's eyes meeting mine, as if to say we taught the aisle a verb. The cockpit door cracked on the beep, normal as coffee. "We heard your show," the FO said, smiling without asking questions she didn't want answers to. The captain logged times, the world's most beautiful bureaucracy. Strange lighting, cooperative cabin, no write-ups beyond cosmetics. "Cosmetics," I said. "And creamer." Ops sent a groom. He blinked at the powder and then shrugged the way ramp people shrug at everything except time. "We'll vacuum your snow," he said. I wanted to tell him to leave a little, like salt on a road in case winter comes back while you're sleeping. On my final pass, I knelt at row 16, the spot where we'd first said stay. The seat track there showed a smudge inside the seam, where no mopping gets, a thin film like oil left by a story. I pressed a knuckle to the carpet. Cold? Warm? Just there. Farah stood at 1L, with the last passengers gone, and the bridge retracted an inch. Rubber collar relaxing like a mouth letting go. "Ready?" "Ready," I said, and told the airplane what it had taught me to mean by it. "Cabin ready." We armed doors on the next leg without thinking. That's the joke, how quickly muscles make oaths into chores. I put the pin where the pin sleeps and felt the hush that follows a vow. Later, hours, reports, coffee, a shower that felt like it had more altitude than water. I lay in the dark of a crash pad that was trying to be a room and thought about shape. But how much of flying is walking a line, centerline, timeline, lifeline, and teaching the dark the difference between a door and a path. My phone vibrated once with a message from Farah, a photo of the forward mirror taken while cleaners worked. Just us two reflected, hair down, eyes silly with the relief embarrassment of survivors. In the corner of the frame, the exit plaque looked dull as a dead coin. Between our ankles, a faint strap-wide darkness ran along the carpet and disappeared under the seat track, like a river that knew the way home. I typed and deleted a dozen replies that tried to be clever and landed on the only sentence that belongs to us now. "We do not open anything in flight." She hearted it. That was enough. Hours later, a jump-seater on the next red eye would swear the aisle seemed to remember the path better with the lights low. Maintenance would log, cabin lighting acting normal per byte. An ops email would ask if anyone had spilled creamer mid. Life is excellent at not believing excellent stories, but if you ever fly East Air 141 at night and glance down, rows 10 through 16, and find the runner a shade darker where the figure 8 used to be, that's not stain, that's grammar. The aisle learned walk. We learned guard, and somewhere under the seat track a length of night is waiting to be told, stay by anyone with a cart, a calm voice, and a line of powdered stars. When we armed the door for the first departure after, My hands didn't shake. The exit plaque over 2R didn't pulse. The floor path dashes minded their manners. Farah nudged me with her shoulder at the forward galley, a ritual we invented to mean we're here. "Rowan," she said, eyes on the door, smile in her voice. "Are we?" "Cabin ready," I said, and the dark, polite as a passenger who's finally learned the drill, stayed in its seat. If this aisle stalker made your palms sweat, drop a like, subscribe to the story Beyond the Impact, and share with someone who loves their horror with real procedures and real airplanes.